Good evening. Hi, everyone. My name is Catherine Platt, and I'm the director of the Hong Kong International Literary Festival. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you tonight to the opening event of our 21st festival, the Rebound Edition. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. And welcome to everyone watching online around the world, and those of you who are watching the screening of this talk at Banyan Workspace here in Hong Kong. It is really wonderful to finally be here on the opening day. And over the next 10 days, we have more than 70 online and live events coming up. I'm sure you've already looked at our website. If you haven't, please browse through our program. The brochure is online. We have some very exciting headline speakers, and we are especially thrilled to present 2021 Booker Prize winner, Damon Galgut, who will be speaking on next Thursday, the 11th of November at Asia Society. And that event kicks off our festival weekend when between Thursday and Sunday, we'll have more than 50 events that can be attended in person at Asia Society and the Fringe Club and Tycoon. And there's really going to be something for everybody. We have obviously amazing fiction, we have poetry, we have podcasters, we have poker players, we have history, language, AI, and of course, lots of events based around our Rebound theme with a focus on recovery and resilience and mental health. And that brings me to tonight's event, where I'm really delighted to welcome Germaine Leece and Sonya Tsakalakis, who are going to speak about their book, Reading the Seasons, Books Holding Life and Friendship Together. And we really couldn't have found a more perfect way to launch a book festival that has mental health and wellness as its theme. Germaine and Sonya are bibliotherapists. They use reading as therapy, prescribing books to help their clients cope with emotional problems and changes in their lives, and much more. But I'm not going to talk about that. I know that they can explain it much better than I can. But I am going to just run through a few points very quickly about Crowdcast. A lot of people are watching online. If you haven't used Crowdcast before, you can put comments in the chat on the right-hand side down there. If you have questions for the speakers, and please do post your questions, whether you're online or whether you're in person. Online, you can click on that Ask a Question box down in the right there, and a box will pop up where you can put your questions. There's also a green button at the bottom of the screen that you can click through to be connected to our bookseller, Bookazine, to buy the author's book. The event is going to stay on Crowdcast until the end of November, so you can watch on demand anytime until then, and we will be adding Chinese subtitles as well within a few days. So I would just like to say a very sincere thank you to all of our cultural partners and sponsors and donors for their generous support that makes these events possible. And in particular tonight, I would like to acknowledge the Consulate of Australia in Hong Kong, who are sponsoring tonight's event. And also to acknowledge an ongoing grant from the Standing Committee on Language, Education and Research. So without further ado, I'm very pleased to introduce our moderator for today's event, Jennie Orchard. And Jennie actually introduced Germaine and Sonya to me and to the festival, and told me about their book. So it's very fitting that she's here tonight to speak with them. Jennie has been an advisor and a good friend to the festival for many years, and she has worked in the literary world in many different capacities for more than 4 decades. Most recently, she was the curator of an anthology, The Gifts of Reading, which was inspired by the writer Robert Macfarlane, and it includes essays on reading by 22 wonderful high-profile writers. So as Jennie is the curator of another inspiring book about reading, she really is ideal person to lead this conversation. So I will hand over to Jennie and to say a little bit more and to bring in Germaine and Sonya. I hope you enjoy the event and look forward to seeing you at many more book talks over the next 10 days. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Thank you so much. And welcome to everybody who's here, whether in person or online. I happen to know we've got people here online from Tokyo, from London, from Sydney, as well as Melbourne, and even Yukai in northern New South Wales. So it's a really international gathering, and there may be other places that I haven't mentioned. Anyway, this is a thrilling night, this first night of the 21st edition of the Hong Kong International Literary Festival, and it's called the Rebound Edition. And I think it was quite inspired to decide to focus on mental health and resilience and wellness at this particular time. And yes, it was a wonderful thing to discover this book, Reading the Seasons by Germaine Leece and Sonya Tsakalakis. And when I told Catherine about it, she immediately wanted to include these two in the festival. And it's turned out that here we are on the opening night. So thank you, Catherine, and welcome again to everybody. So just to get us all in the mood, I'm going to read a quote about reading that I particularly like and think is suitable for tonight. And this comes from Maria Popover, who's an author and the creator, the founder of the newsletter Brain Pickings. The wondrous thing about being human, the beauty and banality of it, is that we all tend to dwell in the same handful of elemental struggles, joys, and sorrows, which is why a book one person writes may help another process her own life a century later, and why a blog by a solitary stranger may speak to many other solitary dwellers across time and space. So I came across this book a few months ago, and even though I already owned piles of books about reading, I felt compelled to buy this one. I love the cover. I particularly loved the subtitle, Books Holding Life and Friendship Together. And there's a quote on the front, a gorgeous book. It's fascinating to watch a friendship build one letter at a time. And so the story of this book is the story that the friendship that has grown between Germaine and Sonya, created through the letters that they've written to each other about the books that they love, the books that they prescribe. And at the same time, it's an intimate memoir because they reveal quite a lot of themselves about their families, their friends, their journeys, pre-COVID journeys, their gardens, even the food they cook, the wine they drink, and the occasional cocktail. But the extraordinary thing is, since the book was published this year, there hasn't been much opportunity for them to meet. And yet, through these letters, they've come to know each other very well. So I thought rather than me introducing them, I would ask them to introduce each other. And so, Germaine, would you start by giving us a few words about Sonya?
Hi, thanks, Jenny. So, yeah, Sonya, there's lots of words I could use to describe Sonya, but I think I really want to start with the fact she's a lover of poetry, neglected female writers, and classics. And she's taught me a lot about those areas as well. And she's also someone who has a line of poetry that she can whip up at any occasion. But her journey into bibliotherapy began in the aged care setting and working with different communities before she then started working as a bibliotherapist at the School of Life in Melbourne, which is how we met when she sent me an email introducing herself and asking me to get in touch. And then our story continued in the book.
So now perhaps, Sonya, could you come and say a few words about Germaine? Hi, Sonya.
Hello, Jenny. Hello, Germaine, and hello, everyone from Melbourne. So Germaine, she came to bibliotherapy after finding it was a perfect marriage from her previous career as in the world of publishing and her current occupation as a psychotherapist. And the stories that abound in her practice as a psychotherapist resonated for her in her practice as bibliotherapist, where she found the stories within the pages of the book. And what I found through my correspondence with Germaine is that she's introduced me to the avant-garde and to writers that I probably wouldn't have discovered myself because of my predilection for the classics and neglected writers. So I found it's been a very expansive way of connecting through our love of expanding our repertoire of reading and how we can help our clients. And Germaine, she was a resident bibliotherapist for the Sydney branch while I was the one for Melbourne.
Okay, that's lovely. Thank you so much for doing that, both of you. I think you said more meaningful things than I could have said about both of you. But what I wonder, you talk in your early letters about, I love the fact that you talk about your reading gaps and your reading angst. And I'm sure that's something that many people here tonight can relate to because there are so many books. So Sonya, I know that you lead a particularly busy life as a single parent. And I'm wondering how on earth is it that you can juggle all the demands and still find quiet time for reading, for writing to Germaine, and doing everything else that you need to do?
Well, that's very interesting you should ask that, Jennie, because I had this conversation with a client only a few weeks ago, and we were talking about how life is busy and we need to prioritize things. And this particular client, she loved exercise, and every day she would exercise. And for me, well, I exercise every day too, but I think reading is an integral part of my daily life. And I would say that it takes discipline to invite enchantment in life. And I need that enchantment, like I need to eat and to exercise every day. It's of equal value. So it's sort of non-negotiable that I find time for reading. So that means I probably don't watch as much TV. I don't know what's going on in the world. Sometimes I'm a bit vague about current affairs, but that's okay because you can't do everything. And I'd rather lose myself in a book and come out of it feeling replenished and renewed than lose myself in the labyrinth of the endless news cycle, which is what can happen, which can be the trap.
Well, I love that idea that you're seeking enchantment in a disciplined way. That's absolutely wonderful. So a little bit later, we're going to get to maybe a few of the people that you've worked with as bibliotherapists. But first, I thought, as Catherine said, we would like to hear a little bit from you two about what this work is, because I was actually quite surprised that even really literary friends said to me, well, what is bibliotherapy exactly? So Germaine, perhaps you could start by telling us a little bit about the practice of bibliotherapy and how you became a bibliotherapist.
Yeah, sure. It's interesting, isn't it? Because we still get that question all the time. I've never heard of bibliotherapy. Is this something new? And, you know, it's ancient. It's back into ancient Greece, as Sonya would tell you, with libraries with healing place of the soul written above them. And for me, I suppose what really resonated about bibliotherapy was reading Freud saying, wherever I go, I find a poet has been there before. And it just really captivated me, that understanding that these poets and writers from centuries ago were able to put emotions and feelings and struggles and just the experience of being human into literature. And so bibliotherapy literally means books, using books for therapy. And I think what we do through our practice is help people work out what their relationship with reading is. So we all naturally, I think unconsciously, are drawn to read certain books at certain times. You know, I'm sure everyone's had that experience of, oh, I didn't know I needed to read that book right now, or that line, I didn't know I needed to know that right now. And I actually think that what we can do is have a conversation and give people space to really explore what they can get from their reading. And then that will lead you to a whole different relationship with how you read moving forward. And we all are our own bibliotherapists, really.
That's a wonderfully articulate explanation of the bibliotherapy role. Thank you for that. And yes, your book was exactly what I needed to read at the time. And you even gave me a prescription quite early on in our exchange of emails. Anyway, Sonya, as Catherine mentioned, no, I think Germaine mentioned earlier, you have worked with older people in aged care settings. And I know that you're also going to be working with some younger people through the Hong Kong Lit Fest. And I thought you might like to talk about your work with those groups and tell us how it goes.
Yes, that's how I began as a bibliotherapist, is within the milieu of the group setting. So work the shared reading, which is inspired by the work of the Reader organisation in the UK. I want to learn as much as I could, so I did actually go to London to participate in shared reading in the public libraries. And I love the idea how we can all sit and read from the same text and read slowly and ponder and reflect on some of the meanings and the language. And this is what I tried to replicate in my own way in aged care settings, where every week I went to a number of aged care facilities. And there'd be a group of sometimes 10, sometimes 8 people. And we would read from the same story. And one particular story that comes to mind is What Was the Nose, which is in our book. And one of the residents has dementia. And normally she's quite reticent and withdrawn, but there was a reference to a particular object that was made of rosewood. It was a snuff box, and I didn't know anything about a snuff box until I read this 18th century piece of literature. And then suddenly she had a vivid recollection of her grandmother and how she remembered her grandmother's snuff box on the mantelpiece, and it evoked this story. So what I loved about this practice of shared reading is the story acted as a catalyst for all the stories that everybody else had within the shared reading environment in that space. It was very powerful, vivifying not only the story itself, because it's so, and I think this is one something I read in your book, Jennie. One of your contributors talks about words are too important not to be said aloud. And this is what was happening. These words that were coming from the story, as they danced off the page, they vivified these residents in the aged care setting. And it was just so beautiful. And one particular place, I did this weekly work for 3 years. And it was wonderful to see the meanings that were emerged for each particular participant, but also the connections that were formed. And so it was a very powerful way of beginning as a bibliotherapist.
Yeah, that's extraordinary, because I've heard about people working with music and older people, but not really about books. But everything you say rings true to me. And yeah, it sounds like, I just hope that when I'm in my old age, there's a bibliotherapist wherever it is I am. Anyway, what I want to do at this point is to say to the audience that we're actually going to involve you at some point. So Catherine said you would be invited to ask questions, but what I'd actually like you to think about is the possibility of asking for a prescription, because the work of Germaine and Sonya in all these different settings reaches so many different kinds of people for different reasons. So they may be prescribing books for somebody who's having marriage difficulties, or somebody whose children are leaving home, or somebody who's moving to a new destination, somebody who's worried about aging, or somebody who's ill. Even I remember reading about a parent looking for support with a transgender child. So there are all those possibilities. And then on a lighter note, I think they've been asked to prescribe poetry and prescribe summer reads and prescribe books for people who are stuck. So everybody sitting out there online or with us in person, have a think. Is there a prescription that you would actually like? So while you're thinking about that, I'm going to ask Germaine, how was it that, did one of you or both of you come up with the idea of creating a book out of your letters? And then how easy was it to find a publisher?
Well, it was really strange. It was not strange. I think it meant it was the right timing. We both had the idea for the book in the same week. And I wrote to Sonya saying, because before I say that, actually, I should say that we'd both been confused about how to talk about bibliotherapy if we were interviewed, because journalists would often say, oh, give us your top 10 books for grief, give us your top 10 books for divorce. And we'd be, oh, well, you know, a book is as unique as the person reading it, and what one person takes from someone, you know, would take something completely different. And so I think they kind of got fed up with, oh, well, we don't really have a list. It depends on the person, depends on the stage they're at, and it was all too hard. So I suddenly realized our letters actually show bibliotherapy in action. We're doing it for ourselves and for each other. And so I wrote to Sonya and said, I suddenly thought this book could be a way of explaining bibliotherapy. And Sonya wrote back saying, oh, that's really strange. I had that thought this week too. So then it just was like, well, we have to see this through now. That's just too strange. And very early on, actually, so we wrote a proposal, and we had a couple of publishers interested, but one didn't want the letter format. They wanted us to sort of write a how-to bibliotherapy book. And again, we felt, no, the letters, and because we had that other angle of not only do we use books to help ourselves, but books actually allowed us to have this very close friendship quite quickly. And I think it was C.S. Lewis who talks about writing letters enlarges upon feelings that would otherwise go unnoticed in conversation. And I think that was so important, that when we both wrote to each other, we would take time and reflect and want to write something meaningful. And I think through writing to Sonya, I started understanding my relationship with books and how they spoke to me. And I don't know that I would have understood that or noticed that if I hadn't have been writing to her. So the letters were extremely important that we keep it in that format. And then it fell into the hands of Sally Heath, our amazing publisher at Thames and Hudson, who just got it straight away and loved the idea and wanted to improve upon it, wanted us to put some client stories in. We've got the margin notes where we give extra book ideas, which is sort of like us talking to you, the reader. And so it was a real collaborative process then. And we just knew it was in the right hands with Sally, because she became even more passionate, perhaps, Sonya, than you and I did. She believed in us anyway, I should say. So yeah, so that was how we found her, and then it all just went from there.
And then in addition to the margin notes, you've got these fantastic lists at the back. I mean, so helpful. And I think the first time I read the book, I marked 35 books I wanted to read. And I think going back later, there was another whole lot. So yes, anyway, I think I need to join a library rather fast. So what I'd love you to do now is I'd love each of you to talk about a client. There's somebody in particular I've got in mind for you, Germaine. But Sonya, let's come to you first, because Germaine's just been speaking. I'd love you to think of somebody memorable that's crossed your path in recent years, and how they approached you, what they wanted and what you prescribed.
This was a number of years ago. I did have some overseas clients, because we were featured in the New Yorker, and it attracted clients from different parts of the world. And one client was from Canada, and this was a gift from his son. And he didn't know what to expect, and he was rather skeptical about what bibliotherapists could offer him, because he was well read. And he says, I often talk to my independent bookseller about books, and they give me ideas. And I was trying to persuade him to understand that this was about getting to know him and seeing what his passions were, where he'd like to go with his reading, and perhaps experience that enlargement of self, as Germaine was alluding to earlier. And he remained skeptical, and he drank a lot of wine. So, yes. And, but it was interesting. After he got the prescription, I put Gilead by Marilynne Robinson on, and he hadn't encountered Marilynne Robinson before, and he expressed this enormous gratitude, because what he found by reading this book, by discovering this author, he was able to work through some unresolved issues he had with his deceased father, who was also a pastor, as the protagonist of Gilead is, of a small town. So that really resonated for him, and that was unexpected for me to see that would have such an effect. So sometimes I find even when you prescribe books, you don't really quite grasp the impact it has on the person who receives the prescription of the titles. There's something mysterious that goes on, but at the same time, there is an intuition. And he acknowledged that. He says, oh, there was an intuition. There was intuition in the way you came about prescribing that book, and he was very appreciative. So it was wonderful to see that transformation from skepticism to acknowledging that it was a valuable experience for him.
It sounds like it was a wonderful experience for the two of you as well, for you to feel that you had really reached him in such a meaningful way. And of course, he could then go on and read the other superb books by Marilynne Robinson in that quartet. So, Germaine, there was somebody in particular I came across online who is a younger person, and she wrote, my name is Claire, and I'm an all-round book lover that's trying out bibliotherapy for the first time. I've got a real intense worry about the future, like most people my age. We already know that climate change, political upheaval, and God knows what else are going to affect our future negatively. It's now just a question of how much. And because a lot of the conversations I have about my fears don't end positively or with any course of action, I thought that bibliotherapy might help. So I don't know how long ago this young person approached you, but can you tell us a little bit about the process of working with her and maybe some of the books that you recommended?
Yes. Yeah. No. Yes, I worked with Claire just after the horrific bushfire season, actually, and before the pandemic. And so it was really interesting timing because she was right on that cusp of, early 20s, really stepping into adulthood identity, but still kind of trying to, at a crossroads of a whole lot of different paths opening up for her, and a whole lot of uncertainty about the world sitting there too, which is normal, except even more heightened given we'd just gone through that bushfire season and there was word of COVID as well. So I thought this was a great opportunity it was perfect timing for bibliotherapy, because it was perfect timing to bring in books from authors long ago who can show us that no matter what happens, the world continues on. And, I love James Baldwin's quote about you think your pain and heartbreak is unprecedented in the world, but then you read that feeling of actually we've all been here before and we will get through it. So all the books I prescribed her, actually, was memoir and fiction, and it had a common thread of, no matter what's going on, life goes on. And so if you want me to say a couple that really stood out, I went with Persepolis, the graphic memoir novel by Marjane Satrapi. And it was all about how she came of age during she came of age in Iran during the revolution there. And so that personal growth during really unstable times and how she got through that, I thought would be really important sort of model for her to how she found her identity. And then another book I prescribed her that I really, really love. And actually I just noticed someone's put a question in the comments about claiming your dreams and labeling yourself as the person you wish to be. And I think this could work there too, is Lolly Willows, which is a classic by Sylvia Townsend Warner. It was written in 1926. And it's all about becoming your own anchor and pursuing your dreams, about a woman who becomes a witch in her middle age. And it's really a message that was sort of written about the frustration of women having to return to their dull lives, as she said, after World War I. And one of my favourite quotes from it is Lolly saying, "One doesn't become a witch to run around being harmful or to run around being helpful either. It's to escape all that, to have a life of one's own, not an existence sold out to you by others." So I find that it was a really nice way to claim your dreams.
Well, that's very handy that you've already answered one of the questions, because I've had a few come in from the audience downstairs, and I can see another couple coming up on the screen here. So thank you, Germaine. That was a wonderful description of how you worked with Claire. So Sonya, back to you, and I'm going to ask you an interesting one here. Somebody is asking, do you think that listening to audiobooks works as well as reading books in therapy?
I'd say it's probably even works better for some people, especially if you have a wonderful narrator. If you find a great narrator that can read so powerfully and movingly, it can have such an effect. And it's such a wonderful way to invite reading into your life if you feel like you're time poor, when you're if you're going for a run, or when you're driving, if you're commuting. I find quite a few actual clients that I'm seeing in the time of the pandemic are turning to audiobooks because they find it's a useful way of reading, and it's not as tiring as holding a book or looking at a Kindle. So I think it's just as beneficial having an audiobook. And as I said before, if you've got a great narrator, it can be quite powerful. And I do hear stories from clients who say, "Oh yes, this is the book that I love because I had this great narrator and they made it extra wonderful for me. And I don't think I would have derived as much pleasure from it if I had read it myself." So yes, I think it can be a very good
Oh,
way.
that's fantastic. It probably answers another question from somebody in the audience here who's saying, how can someone migrate from reading emails and short news back to reading books? So maybe Audible books are one way of doing that. Have you got any other thoughts about that, Germaine?
I just wanted to, add, I once had a client in her 80s who loved audiobooks because it reminded her of being read to by her father. And I found that particularly moving and had to obviously prescribe Stephen Fry reading Harry Potter because, there's something about that male narrative voice that just, she sat in her armchair and remembered being a child and being read to, which I thought was particularly beautiful. But sorry, your question about reading short grabs and emails and whether audiobooks could be good for that. Definitely.
No, it's more someone's saying that they have got stuck with reading emails and short news, and how can they progress back to books?
Right. Yes. Well, if it is a time poor thing, I often then go for quite a different genre, like the graphic novel. I'm not sure if this person's ever read a graphic novel, but like Persepolis, Fun Home, Alison Bechdel's another wonderful book to get completely lost in a completely different format or a completely different way of reading. Reading pictures as well as words can be good. And then I always think short stories can be a good way to get back into getting used to reading a story, because you get a whole story in a short amount of time. And even just one story before bed. Or I had a client who started reading a short story at breakfast rather than looking at her phone. So that's another way to maybe get back into it.
That is a really good idea, isn't it? I know that writers often do the morning pages to get themselves into writing mode, and I think a lot of us would benefit from reading morning pages. So somebody online is asking about the recommendation for books that help her with her relationships with adult children. Sonya, do you think you've got anything to answer there?
I would suggest Tessa Hadley's The Past. I love the way Tessa Hadley writes about relationships and the nuances, and she's so sensitive to how, in this particular story, these are adult siblings and they come together and they're visiting an ancestral home, and they all have each very different, unique memories of growing up in that place and their grandparents being around and their parents. And now they're relating to each other as adults. And it's very interesting to see that the patterns that have developed, and it's so nuanced, and you get such an insight into how each character sees themselves, and they see themselves still as a child, even though they're in their middle-aged. So you get an insight. This is how adult children can be within the context of a family, that they still hold on to those childhood patterns and those childhood way of relating to each other. And that gives, I think, the parent insight into their adult children's minds. So it's like, oh, I'm like a voyeur. This is what they're thinking. This is how they're feeling about things growing up. And it can be perhaps a more oblique way of engaging with adult children by getting into that interiority. And I think that's something we talk about quite a lot in our book, is the pleasure of almost standing on the threshold of a person's mind and seeing how he unfolds, and what are they dreaming, what are they worried about. And Tessa Hadley, I think, does that beautifully in The Past, where you are getting, I feel like you know the characters more than you would know, perhaps even yourself. She's that nuanced, and she's so clever at picking up the minute details of the inner workings of someone's mind.
Yeah, I think William Boyd said almost exactly that in his essay in my book, talking about the fact that the novelist actually knows his characters better than he even knows his neighbours. So, Germaine, thank you, Sonya. Have you got another book to add into that equation, the relationships with adult children? Because I think that's probably something that's maybe on the mind of a lot of the people here.
And the family sagas or the family multi-generational stories are always, great at that too, aren't they? But I think I love Penelope Lively's How It All Began, which is about, you've read that one too, have you, Jennie?
Yes, I've read some, not that particular one, but I'm just
nodding. It's about a mother who falls and breaks a hip, and she has to convalesce at her adult daughter's home. And so she sort of sits and watches all the different relationships around her, and how that one incident sort of sets off another chain of events. But it's a time when she actually has to sit and reflect. And actually thinking about that, another book I love that I made Sonya read that she loved too is Absent in the Spring by Mary Bessamacott, who is the nom de plume for Agatha Christie. And it's all about a woman on her, it's between the wars, isn't it, Sonya? I think it's in the, I can't remember the era.
Yeah, I think it is between the wars, Is it 20?
She's on a train on her way back from visiting her daughter in the Middle East back to England, and they get stuck in a rainstorm, and she has to spend a few days on her own, and she's never had that time on her own, and she's been a very intrusive mother, an intrusive wife, and she has this time, starts to realise how she's contributed to the relationships around her, and I won't spoil the ending, but it's that question of, is that reflection time enough to actually change how she's going to be with the people, or not? So I'll leave it there. But that's a really enjoyable one too, and a very interior life one where it's just her in the desert, isn't it? Just walking up and down, thinking, and
that's right.
If you want the big cast of characters and all the different dynamics, or you just want to really be in someone's head as they're exploring those issues, they're two books that do that.
That's what reminds me when you were talking about that, was it Paul Bowles, The Sheltering Sky, that whole idea of being lost in a desert. And then you've got yourself, you can't, who else can you talk to? But you're going to count, it's hard to talk to anyone but yourself. So you are in your head. So there is that existential angst, and it's so powerful, isn't it, the way it's described. I found I think it's Paul Bowles, The Sheltering Sky, being in the desert, away from the familiar, and how it triggers an inwardness, an inward kind of cogitation that's quite deep and searching, like you're excavating. And it's something about that, isn't it, about being out in a desert.
And then do you shove it all back down when you go home, or do you actually make use of what you've excavated, is the question.
They came to an unfortunate end in The Sheltering Sky. So maybe it's not a good thing to go down so deep.
Well, one of our questioners here is saying, well, we've lost travel. I'm going to come back to her question. We've still got 3. And the one that I'm going to put to you straight away, because I happen to know you've both got teenage children. How do you reintroduce the joy of reading to a teen who has been lured by laptops, emails and technology? I reckon you both have something to say about that, Germaine.
You can start.
I think my children rebel by not reading, but actually that's unfair. I'm finding that as I'm moving, so I've got an 18-year-old, a 16-year-old and a 13-year-old. And I think the middle teen years are a desert of reading, they were in my house. And the 18-year-old has now discovered like romantic fiction and that was sort of what we used to call chick lit, I guess, and a few friends who are also reading. And I mean, lockdown in Sydney helped with that because they were limited with what they could do. So she and some friends almost started like a mini book club, and it's really got her back into reading, and that's been helpful. My 16-year-old son hasn't got there yet, but I do notice how they tend to use movies, and they're still in story. Like, even though they're stuck on those laptops and the technology, I do find you still get into really interesting conversations with them about plots and stories and characters. And they might not be the kind of characters that we would have found in books as teenagers. But then as a teenager, I was reading Flowers in the Attic by Virginia Andrews. And so, you know, watching some kind of movie, or, you know, it's probably not that different, but there's still a sense of searching for story and trying to figure out who they are in different mediums. And then my 13-year-old, I can still get him interested a bit, but it's comics. It's graphic novels, comics. Lemony Snicket, I think, is brilliant for fantastic vocabulary and, you know, getting lost in his crazy mind. So yes, I really sympathise, because it's been a struggle that I found I've had to just let go of, and suddenly I watch books appear in the house. But yeah, good luck. Sonya's probably may have better thoughts than me on that.
Sonya, be brief, because actually I've got another 3 questions after this.
Well, no, I've grappled with that too, but I find my daughter's turning back to books because she's 16, and she was always a great reader, and she used to be told off at school at lunchtimes, why aren't you playing? Because she'd be under a tree reading like I used to. And so she read it avidly, and then for a few years she stopped when she discovered social media, but she's turning back to books. And I think children model what you do, and they just see me on the couch reading a lot. So that's one way of helping children see this is normalizing reading. It's part of life. Just to be very brief.
Thank you for that. No, that's actually perfect, because I think role modeling is incredibly important. And having children who are now much, much older than teens, I also believe that, people come back to books later. And, you know, as you've said yourselves, you know, we all read different things at different times depending on our needs. So I've got a request now for a prescription for loss and grieving. And this comes from a recently qualified and practicing counsellor who says many people are grieving the loss of time with family and friends, the loss of adventure and travel because of quarantine. And she is interested in prescribing books to clients as opposed to depending on therapy. Okay, so Sonya, do you want to jump in first there?
I can think of a book I just started. I've just finished actually, and I did actually put on someone's prescription just recently. Olga Tokariuk's Flights, and she calls them, they're fragments, and she calls them constellations, and they're just meditations on travel and anatomy, on what it means to be human, and it's based on fiction. But I love the way when you're experiencing grief and loss, you can only digest so much. You don't want a big, well, some people would say, it's very personal, but some people would say they prefer just small bites. And the beauty of Flights is that you're getting these wonderful stories, or these wonderful reflections on, like, for example, this particular person in one story, he's on holiday in Croatia, he's from Poland, and he's sitting alone at a table, and he's noticing someone else at a table with all their friends, and he's feeling this alienation. And I think it's very consoling to read about how it feels when you're in that space, when you're feeling alone and processing the grief of loss, when you can read about it and read that experience from the viewpoint of someone else who is in that situation. But and it's just the way it's written, and I felt, oh, that means a lot to me, because I recognize this feeling. This is loss. This is what it feels like. But this is articulated so beautifully in the words that she uses, and I think that's probably one of the things that happens when we're in that state of grief. We haven't got the words. We need the language, and some writers have, well, this is what great writers do. They have the language to put into words the feelings that we are experiencing in the moment. And I found that was quite helpful.
Yeah, incredibly helpful. And I think you've both written in your books about reading notebooks and how sometimes actually, I think maybe it was you, Germaine, who you write quotes in a reading notebook and then you go back to them at a time when you need support of a particular kind. And yeah, I do exactly the same. So that's a wonderful thing to do. I want to read this because it comes from somebody who's listening in the car, who spoke to her sister, who's struggling with balancing the needs of her 2 newly diagnosed with type 1 diabetes children. What would you recommend to give her strength and restoration as she works on this lifelong parenting challenge? That's a pretty serious situation to be in. Germaine, have you got some thoughts about that?
Yeah, it's a really difficult situation to get your head around and process. And I imagine there'll be many different stages of how you go dealing with that too. So actually, for something kind of quite different, there's a beautiful book I love called The Hen Who Dreamed She Could Fly. It's a South Korean book by Sunmi Hwang. And I love it because it's all about this hen who's too old. All she wants to do is lay an egg, hatch an egg, and be a mother. And she's too old. And yet it's actually a beautiful story about how she still finds a way to live her dream. It's not the way she thought it would be. It's not going to turn out the way she thought it would. Yet in some ways it's even more satisfying. And I think it's a lovely book for having to rethink what your dreams might be, or it's a way of not feeling the same loss, but turning that into something different and perhaps even richer and deeper. So if you're at the stage of wanting to, it's a lot of hope. If you're at that stage of wanting to read something that fills you with a bit of hope for a different kind of future, then I think that could be a lovely book. But that's also not to say that you need to skip over the grief and loss that comes with that kind of diagnosis, with any kind of change, with any kind of unexpected adjustment. And I think it can be really important to be able to read into those emotions too. And I'm just thinking about a client I once had in a completely different situation, but had just separated from her husband and was so filled with anger and rage at that sort of stage. And I prescribed her Days of Abandonment by Elena Ferrante. And it's such a difficult book to read in some parts because it's so raw and powerful. And yet she said it was perfect because she was pushing people away with her anger. And that book was a place where her anger was heard and seen, because the Days of Abandonment is very much about the madness that comes with grief. So sometimes finding a book that kind of reflects the stage you're in, because it's too hard for other people to be able to meet you there, can be good too.
And there's a book that I know you love and I love that's about self-care, and that's A Gift from the Sea by Anne Morrow Lindbergh. I wonder if that would be a good book for this mother to have, just to understand the importance of quiet time, of solitude. So do you want to say a couple of words about that before I give Sonya the final question?
Gift from the Sea, isn't it? Anne Morrow Lindbergh, who was the wife of Charles Lindbergh. So did have a lot of grief in her life as well. These are little book. This is essays she wrote in the 1950s when she went to the beach one day, and each shell kind of represented a different. She was trying to work out what her identity was, away from being a mother, a carer, a wife. And it's a beautiful book for thinking about the different life transitions we go through, and how we separate ourselves from those relationships. And she writes an essay at the back 20 years later saying, it still amazes me how today I still reach so many women. It's still, what I write resonates. And I would say, and I think that must have been in the 90s or maybe 80s, but I would say today it's still very relatable despite her writing it in the 50s. And that might also be a nice way to think about finding a place for yourself while you also have to take on this huge medical responsibility for your children too, and it's a reminder about the long chapters of life, and that this will pass, and you will adjust to this, and that's a good one, Jennie.
And as one of you just said, I can't remember which one it was, I mean, sometimes these situations of adversity really do produce richness in the long run, extra depth. So this is going to be the final question, because we haven't got so much more time, and I know you have to read something towards the end. Anyway, this one says, is it true you both use only fiction and poetry for bibliotherapy? And if so, why? Why not non-fiction? Now, I know that's not true. You don't only use fiction. Sonya, would you like to speak to that one?
Yes, you're right. It's not only fiction, but it's predominantly fiction. And I do use some non-fiction, like maybe a memoir, or even I love certain writers like Olivia Laing, The Lonely City, where it sort of reads like a narrative. But the reason why well, I prescribe mostly fiction, is I find it engages the imagination. It takes you on a journey rather than it being directive as fiction and non-fiction can be. You feel like you're being led somewhere, and it helps you. I think it was Richard Ford that said, fiction reveals things to us about life that life cannot teach us. So there is, it just helps us to be a bit more creative in finding our own pathway when we can read fiction rather than looking at it from the perspective of someone else who may be directing us. It depends what non-fiction we're talking about, because there's such variety. There's a narrative non-fiction, but I found there's great power in using fiction.
And poetry, but we're going to come to that in a minute.
Poetry, yes, that's right.
So we actually, I mean, we haven't got so much more time. And what I'd like to say to anybody who didn't get to ask a question tonight and get an answer, there are a couple of options here. I mean, obviously, you can get the book, and the lists at the end of the book are organized by author, and they're organized by title, and they're organized by subject. So you get lists of books on love in all its glorious mysteries, or strength amid adversity, or human experience, the joy and sorrow. So I can't recommend this highly enough. And the other thing that you might think about is booking yourself a bibliotherapy session, because maybe a lot of you don't realize that you can actually buy one for yourself or gift one to somebody else. And I mean, what an amazing thing to be able to have if you're a book lover, and particularly if there's some particular thing that you want to discuss about yourself or a friend or a family member. Anyway, I think you two have given us many wonderful recommendations, and I can't thank you enough for doing that, because it's quite something to be put on the spot. And you know, the time is drawing to an end, and I want to encourage everybody who's with us tonight to buy copies of this wonderful book, Reading the Season. And also you can get copies of my own book, The Gifts of Reading, tonight. And what I wanted to tell you about that book is everybody who contributed was asked to write about books that they love to give. And at the end of my book, there's a list, just like at the end of Reading the Seasons. And the list is called The Gifts, and it's a list of the 5 books that each contributor likes to give, sorry. And what I'd like to say is, in the interviews I've done during the course of the past year, people often ask me which books I like to give. And I have to say that Reading the Seasons has become one that I like to give a lot. And I hope I can remember who I've given it to. Maybe I'll give them second copies without realizing. Anyway, we're going to end this session in a way that was suggested by Sonya, which is with some poetry. And I think that's a lovely idea. And I don't think Germaine will mind me saying that she was less of a poetry reader at the beginning of this book's journey. She actually wrote, "I'm not sure I really heard poetry until you, Sonya, wrote to me, and now I can't imagine life without it." And I think, you know, that's a wonderful thing, to be able to give each other these gifts of reading. So, Germaine, would you like to start with the poem that you've chosen?
Yes, okay. Yes, so you're right, Jennie. As I was scared of poetry until Sonya kept writing these lines of poetry to me, and oh my gosh, I have to understand that. And so since then, I suddenly buy anthologies of poetry. It's crazy. And the one I wanted to read today really sums up how I feel about reading, or how I'm left after I finish a book. And it's from a collection called Alive Together by Leece Muller. And it's called Reader. A husband, a wife, 3 children. Last year they did not exist. Today the parents are middle-aged. One of the daughters grown. I live with them in their summer house by the sea. I live with them, but they can't see me sharing their walks on the beach, their dinner preparations in the kitchen. I am in pain because I know what they don't, that one of them has snipped the interlocking threads of their lives, and now there is no end to the slow unravelling. If I am a ghost they look through, I am also a Greek chorus, hand clapped to mouth in fear, knowing their best intentions will go wrong. Don't I want to shout, but I am inaudible to them. Beach towels over their shoulders, wooden spoon in hand, they keep pulling at the threads. When nothing is left, they disappear. Closing the book, I feel abandoned. I have lost them, my dear friends. I want to write them, wish them well, assure each one of them my affection. If only they would have let me say goodbye.
Wow, that is a powerful piece. And I think I'd never actually heard of Liesl Müller, isn't it? Yeah. I've got a feeling somebody's going to be asking for a list of the books that you've mentioned during this session. So I hope somebody is taking notes out there and that we can put it maybe up on the website with the recording of this session. So thank you for that, Germaine. Now, Sonya, you said you would surprise me, you would surprise us, and you're going to have more or less the last word. But before you read, I just want to share a couple of sentences you wrote about the importance of poetry in your life, which I like very much. Poems possess a kind of universal silence that touches me across feelings of deep despair. To me, it's an awakening to an otherness that exists within the depths. I venture that's where all the good things are: fortitude, resilience, compassion. So now let's hear what you've chosen to finish with.
Lovely, thank you. Well, I'm going from the sublime to the ridiculous. And I've chosen because I was actually introduced to poetry as a child with the nonsense poems of Edward Lear and Hilaire the Lock. And I love this one by Wallace Stevens. And there is a very deep and profound meaning behind this, but I just love the sound of this one. And it's The Emperor of Ice Cream. Call the roller of big cigars, the muscular one, and bid him whip in kitchen cups concupiscent curds. Let the wenches dawdle in such dress as they are used to wear, and let the boys bring flowers in last month's newspapers. Let be finale of theme, the only emperor is the emperor of ice cream. Take from the dresser of deal, lacking the 3 glass knobs, that sheet on which she embroidered fantails once, and spread it so as to cover her face. If her horny feet protrude, they come to show how cold she is and dumb. Let the lamp affix its beam. The only emperor is the emperor of ice cream.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And interesting that you chose Wallace Stevens, because I think you wrote about Wallace Stevens at one point, didn't you, Germaine, Crossing to Safety? So that's
another great family story, actually.
Yeah,
no, that was Wallace Stegner.
Oh, you're right. You're absolutely right. Yes, sorry. Anyway, I think it's actually quite remarkable. I was worried about sort of finishing on time and said, was it really important? And I was told, no, it was fairly flexible, but everybody's been listening for an hour and I'm sure they might like another drink. So it's time really.
As we all do.
Really, yeah, well, you two need to go to bed. It's 11 o'clock at your end.
Yes.
So I just want to thank you. I want to thank you both so much for your book, which has given me an enormous amount of pleasure. And I know it's given me friends of mine an enormous amount of pleasure. And I also want to thank you for all that you've contributed to this session. And I'm absolutely thrilled with Catherine for being so ready, even though she heard about this book quite late in the day, to take this on board and open the festival with this discussion tonight. And as for the people listening, I hope very much that this session, all about so many different kinds of books and reading experiences, will inspire you to go away and have a really good look at the literary festival offerings, because yes, we have live events for people in Hong Kong, we have some hybrid events, and we have some online events. As Catherine said, there are about 70 of them happening during the course of the next 10 days. So just explore, tell your friends, come along, book, and support this festival. And I'd also like to end with great thanks to Catherine and her very small team for curating this fantastic festival. So thank you all for joining us, and good night wherever you are.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us. It's such a pleasure. Thank you, Jennie.
Real thrill. Thank you.